Friday night, the sounds of horses and hooves rang through the air. Somebody actually fired into the student's residence, at which point one of the students returns fire, and it repels the onslaught for a time. But as the sun rose the following morning, the crowd goes on the offensive again. Mrs. Wallace, but with redoubled ardor, these men persisted in their crime until they hauled the house onto the corner of the common in front and close by the old church. And they arrived upon the spot just at dark, so completely exhausted, both oxen and men, that it was utterly impossible to do anything further. And there they left the schoolhouse, shattered and mutilated beyond reparation. So collectively, this surge of white resistance to black education, which is taking place in the early 1830s, belies some of our most trusted maxims about the history of education, and particularly the history of education in Antebellum America and in New England. Because if you read most histories of education in this time period, they talk about this as the era of the common school. This is an era of expanding educational opportunity, when people like Henry Barnard and Horace Mann are stumping for democracy, working to build schools to instruct every child. So you can see that educational opportunities, in a lot of ways in this time period, are expanding for immigrants and are expanding for women. But the African American experience in Connecticut, also in New Hampshire, I talked about, doesn't really square with that narrative, right? It's difficult to understand then why educational opportunities for some Americans are expanding at the exact same time that you see a real sort of violence against African American schools. The other thing that takes place at this time is you also begin to see the emergence of school segregation. And this happens when towns and cities in the region create their first public schools, and many of them will create what they call African schools that they fund with public money. And it's a way that they can get around creating integrated school systems. So if you look, you begin to see the emergence of school segregation, a number of really violent attacks against African American schools. And also, if you're looking in the South, you begin to see the rise of anti-literacy laws that people often reference when they talk about denial of educational opportunity. So one of the questions that I had is to try to understand what this emergence, or what caused these episodes of violence to take place. Because you have to remember, they're starting in the early 1830s, which means that attitudes about educational opportunity are really changing in this time. And so one of the things that I wanted to figure out, and this will be the central question that's going to frame my talk today, is what is going to cause that phenomenon or that chain of really violent resistance to educational opportunity that's taking place in the early 1830s. And so one way that I found to do this is actually to flashback about 4 years before the proposed college, to look at an earlier debate over educational opportunity that plays out in New Haven. On Friday evening, April 13, 1827, an assembly congregates in New Haven's North Church for the unveiling of a new association, the African Improvement Society, which was dedicated to elevating black people's, in their words, intellectual, moral, and religious condition. The society's origins had stretched back 2 years when Senator Church Minister Leonard Bacon hosted a gathering for friends that were uneasy with both the growth of Southern slavery and also with the North's free black population. Members of the AIS included individuals that had ties to Yale, New Haven's Congregationalist churches, and the Federalist power base of the city. It was comprised largely of whites that were uneasy with Southern slavery, but also that were supporters of the colonization movement, which was designed to, as they put it, repatriate all African Americans back to Africa. And in this way, the AIS embodied a number of the inherent contradictions of the early 19th century's benevolent empire. Its founders believed that it was their duty to uplift people of color, but in the same breath, they also doubted their inherent mental and moral capacity. They sponsored an array of institutions for African Americans, including a day school, an evening school, a temperance society, a savings bank, and a library. And in this way, they aspired to spread the staples of capitalist and Protestant theology, an appreciation for hard work and thrift, temperance, and literacy, lessons that were not revelations to New Haven's African-American community. African Americans in New Haven likely bristled at the racist assumptions that were embodied in the AIS's platform, but also pragmatic about the practical and the symbolic value of educational opportunity they accepted as assistance. They understand that literary instruction would supplement the sparse education that New Haven's public schools provided, and spiritual training in their minds could bring all people of color closer to salvation, or at the very least, closer to biblical Christianity. Not only would the AIS augment educational opportunities for African Americans in New Haven, but worded its activities might inspire other Black people to secure education for themselves and their families, in turn undermining racist and pro-slavery ideology. And newspaper coverage, and this is again where that great chronicle comes in, confirmed that there was actually broad support for the AIS within New Haven's community. The Connecticut Journal called its efforts worthy of a Washington or a Franklin, but editorialists at the New Haven Chronicle endorsed the association a bit more cautiously. They observed, quote, "We do not wish African Americans to become statesmen and legislators. We do not wish them to become our companions, nor do we wish to admit them to our drawing rooms. But we do wish to see them becoming a useful, intelligent, and industrious people, a blessing and not a curse to this city." So with those limitations in mind, they bid the AIS all Godspeed in its endeavor. And so it seemed a consensus had formed. So long as the AIS did not attempt to facilitate racial integration or African Americans' political elevation, it was welcome in New Haven. But then, 1 week after the celebration inaugurating the association into being, the New Haven Chronicle printed a scathing, if not hyperbolic, attack against the AIS under the alias of Aristides, an otherwise unidentified editorialist who castigated the association as alarming and dangerous, and urged its members to, quote, "weigh well the results of their mission." And this is a quote from his first editorial. He writes, "I put it to the sober judgment of every person in this community, whether, if the objects of this society are attained, they will not prove the direct positive cause of a rapid and extensive increase of our colored population. I ask then the society to pause, to weigh well the results of a project fraught with so much mischief. Let them pause and ask themselves whether they are willing that their children should be victims of so dangerous an experiment in extending and perpetuating an evil, the existence of which every good citizen laments. Ameliorate the condition of our present colored population, and you offer a bounty to others whose circumstances are less tolerable, and fell to this as a city of refuge. Every step you take will assuredly strike the roots of evil deeper into our soil." So while his invective actually fills about 2 vertical columns of text, each argument that he's advancing about the dangers of Black education, to white laborers, to the Republic, and also to that mythic history of a free white New England, all circled back to that same contention. Educational opportunity would encumber our efforts to remove African Americans. The word of the association, he feared, would draw more people of color into the community. An expansion in the Seaport's free Black population would come at the expense of the white working classes, whose wages, he argued, would invariably decrease because of that increased competition. And finally, by encouraging or even acknowledging the very presence of African Americans in New Haven, he argued that the AIS would give the lie to assertions that the sin of slavery had somehow skipped over New England. The most pressing problem, according to Aristides, that New Haven's townspeople faced was not, quote, how shall we render this degraded class of beings more tolerable, but how shall we remove them? As local support for the AIS confirmed, before the late 1820s, whites in New Haven are largely tolerant of small-scale efforts to improve African Americans' vocational and literary opportunities. But around 1831, the radical abolition movement begins to eclipse colonization. And in so doing, educators begin to imagine educational opportunity not as a way of deporting African Americans, but actually as a way of affirming their place in the body politic, affirming their place in the polity. And so if you look at the kinds of educational institutions and who is supporting them in that change from the late 1820s, again to that proposed African college, you can see that ideas about what education means and the relationship between education and citizenship are transforming pretty radically. So let's just to give you the framework. A couple of disclaimers. Certainly there's huge differences between the African Improvement Society and the proposed college that we'll talk about. And you have to be careful to not conflate them under a single undifferentiated banner of education. But to my mind, if one wants to understand why attitudes about educational opportunity are changing between that period in 1827 to 1831, when we get to that uproar about the proposed college, to my mind, it's actually very useful to listen to Aristides, because his comments are actually signifying, to my mind, a new period in that history of educational opportunity, a time of opportunity and a time of opposition. Ultimately, Aristides disappears from the printed space about as quickly as he arrives. He authors a couple more editorials, but for the most part, those who write in response to him really are against his position. But Aristides' comments, to my mind, are important again because they represent, as far as I can tell, that first sustained public critique against African American education in New England. And I would argue that that not coincidentally plays out or takes place in New Haven. And those comments portend a dramatic shift. Again, in New England, there's tolerance of educational opportunity for African Americans, a shift that would manifest itself most fully 4 years later. So that's the backdrop that I want to use to frame what takes place in 1831 with the proposed African college. So in 1831, hoping to empower African Americans to access higher education independently, an interracial abolitionist alliance launches a movement to build the first, what they call African college. Two ministers, one by the name of Peter Williams, who's working out of New York, and the other, which many of you are probably familiar with, Simeon Jocelyn, lead the campaign. And after a great deal of consideration, they select New Haven to house the proposed institution, believing, as they put it, that, quote, no place in the Union is the situation of blacks more comfortable, or the prejudices of a community weaker against them. They announced their intentions on September 5th, 1831, and unfortunately their timing could not have been worse if they had tried. Because on August 22nd, 1831, the literate enslaved preacher Nat Turner begins his uprising against the white residents of Southampton, Virginia. Gruesome reports about the educated black man who incited other bondsmen to rise in the name of freedom spread quickly throughout the country. And details of the massacre reached New Haven on September 3rd, which is just 2 days before Jocelyn Williams and his associates announced their revolutionary intentions. Upon learning of the proposal, New Haven's mayor, Dennis Kimberly, assembles an opposition in less than 3 days. September 8th, he calls a city meeting, and that Saturday, over 700 white men packed into the town hall. So great was the interest to hear the discussion, observed one attendant, that notwithstanding the excessive heat and almost irrespirable atmosphere of the room, the hall was crowded throughout the afternoon. And townspeople disparaged the college with a zeal that was reminiscent of Aristides. And as many of you know, they ultimately vote down the proposal by 700 to 4. By the first week in October, college backers withdraw their proposal. But weeks later, whites in New Haven are still unleashing their anger about the college onto tangible symbols of their frustrations: a black-owned hotel, a black-owned home, and an abolitionist summer residence. And debate about the college actually continues in local papers and the local press, and on city streets for months after violence subsides in the city. In light of its reputation for educational enthusiasm, it makes sense that Williams and Jocelyn placed a great deal of faith in New Haven. This is actually something that Rob and I were just talking about, which is, could they have anticipated the kind of reaction that would ensue? And to my mind, they actually had very good reasons for having the faith that they had in New Haven at the time. But they also failed to recognize a number of anxieties towards black aspiration that were building in this period between 1827 and 1831. Many of those same anxieties that Aristides had articulated in 1827. First, you see that access to college degrees are expanding, and that's leading many white elites to worry that the status of their own degrees is diminishing as well. And they argue that conferring diplomas on African Americans would only speed up that declension process. So a number of these colleges would be Amherst, Bowdoin, Colby, the University of Vermont, right? And so you begin to see an expansion in educational opportunities. Sorry about that. You begin to see an expansion in access to higher education for white Americans. But you also see around 1830 a transformation in the goals of the abolitionist movement. Activists begin to demand immediate and not gradual emancipation, and they begin to reach out to a much broader constituency, which is including African Americans and including women. As the abolitionist movement radicalizes and democratizes, many whites in New Haven begin to express their fear that a southern migration of African Americans was looming on the horizon. The twin traumas of Turner's Rebellion and the African College, to my mind, would bring all of those tensions that were latent to a boil. So, to understand the importance of an African college at the time, it's critical to get a sense of how many people are accessing higher education. And at this point in time, in 1830, just over 1% of white men between the ages of 15 and 20 in New England are attending college. So college is a very small number of people. But again, these opportunities are expanding. But while some of these schools are admitting African American students, I know Amherst, where I teach, I think, admitted its first student in 1826. The number of African Americans that are attending college at that point in time is very small. And most of the colleges are denying access to higher education to African Americans. In this context, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the idea for creating an African college emerged. But we know that it probably came out of two circles. One from Sidney and Jocelyn in New Haven, and also from a group of African Americans that were working in New York to expand access to advanced education. People like Peter Williams and also some of his associates created what they called an association for the creation of a high school, and they really had in mind again creating greater access to advanced education for African Americans. So when the group in New York became aware that Jocelyn was working on a similar objective, they contacted him, they wrote and asked if he would send them an outline of his ideas, and he came down to New York and actually met with them, and they agreed then to forego their plans to build a high school in New York and to work together to create a college in New Haven. They agreed that the